Okay, so what we have is first some context about what was going on at the time that this book was written. So America had, for the last probably 20 years, begun to expand outside of the borders of the United States, the continental borders of the United States. And this was creating another set of tensions within the domestic political sphere. So you had the annexation of Hawaii, which by all rights was kind of a sovereign nation. They had ambassadorships. It was a kingdom that had ambassadorships to other nations. And the United States essentially took over. This created a huge divide within America. There's a lot of congressional records going on investigating, okay, is this the path that we need to be doing? Because we had traditionally been an anti-colonial power. And now suddenly we're engaging in the colonial game. And so this was creating a lot of soul searching within America. In short order after that, the Spanish-American War, then we essentially occupied the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then we began the process of again, colonization in those areas. And that again created more tension. When the time of, we spoke at the part one of the series of oligarchs about about Sullivan, Cromwell and Sullivan law firm, and specifically Cromwell, William Nelson Cromwell, who was able to essentially create a new nation of Panama in order to get foreign clients a better deal. And of course, some of his own clients, who were Rockefeller and Morgan, they were the most powerful people in the United States at that time. And so that began to now shift kind of this foreign colonialism outside of government bounds. In other words, before, with the planters and the sugar growers in Cuba, and the Spanish-American War with the annexation of Hawaii with the fruit growers, you had the same appeal to the United States to be able to kind of do the dirty work. But Cromwell initially, because of his law firm experience, was able to kind of do this on a legal measure, still using the United States, but it made it less apparent that it was a form of colonialism. In other words, he put the onus on that it was a revolution, that somebody else was doing it. So the United States was in a turmoil and kind of an identity crisis at the time. There was McKinley had been shot in 1901. So the Republicans, except for one president, Grover Cleveland, from the Civil War up until the turn of the century, the Republicans dominated the presidency. And McKinley had been a very popular president. He was shot in 1901 by, depending on who you read, either an anarchist or a mentally ill immigrant. And so that set shockwaves. The vice president, who was Theodore Roosevelt, was then put into the presidency. And then he became a very popular president because of his charisma and his ability to be able to manipulate the press. And his Vice President Taft came in after Roosevelt had done 2 terms. Vice President Taft became president. He was elected on his own terms. But then they had a falling out, because even within the Republican Party, there were the stalwarts, of what they call the mollycoddles, or the ones that were the old guard, the ones that said, okay, we're going to maintain the position of the Republican Party, which had morphed a lot since Grant's time. So they were no longer kind of at the forefront of kind of constitutionalism. They were more in the lines of kind of profit and big business, as Dollar Bill Hanna, the senator, was kind of the poster boy of that. But they still had a fairly well-grounded group that said, okay, we still need to maintain the status quo as much as we can legally, because if we go too far outside the bounds, we're not sure where that's going to lead. And then you had the radical Republicans, the insurgents as they were known, or the new nationalists, depending upon which period of history you're looking. And that was led by, but not completely organized by, Teddy Roosevelt. He tended to represent what they called the insurgent wing of the Republican Party. And that was what we would today call a radical liberal wing, or a radical kind of neo-socialist wing, that was saying that, the federal government has to impede the United States citizens in order to protect the citizens. And so America did the same kind of trajectory that Europe had been doing later, that it was kind of a statist actions, a statist mindset that was not just in the Democrat side, but also in the Republican side. And it was kind of forgotten, both when Woodrow Wilson eventually became president and Teddy Roosevelt in the later years. Their policies that they presented looked very similar. The Bull Moose Party, that was the Progressive Party, is what eventually it became known as. The policies and procedures that Teddy Roosevelt wanted to put in, mirrored Woodrow Wilson's, especially in his second term, almost exactly. So it was phenomenal to see this kind of uniparty was forming up there. There's nothing new under the sun, right? So there was a uniparty at the turn of the century where part of the Republicans and part of the Democrats actually agreed more than they disagreed on kind of a trajectory where America wanted to go. Of course, during the election between Woodrow Wilson and Taft, Teddy Roosevelt came in as a third party candidate. It split the Republican vote, and Wilson became president. Now, who was Woodrow Wilson? Woodrow Wilson has been up and down within American history. History has been at times kind and cruel to him. But the reality is that he was kind of installed, if you really, really look at it. Woodrow Wilson had been the president of Princeton. He was more of a philosopher. He was very, kind of a more focused on theoretical than practical. He had not led anything practical other than presidency of Princeton. And if you look at the record of his presidency in Princeton, he was a very vindictive man. In other words, he had a very close clique of friends. He was very controlling. And when somebody he felt had betrayed his trust or didn't support him as much as he thought they would, he had a vendetta against him for a very long time. There is some recent evidence to come out, particularly even in kind of a post-mortem psychological analysis by Sigmund Freud, based upon the writings of Edward House, who knew intimately Wilson and wrote in his diary every single day of all of the conversations that he and Wilson had, to include his nightmares. And when Freud examined that, plus interviewed people that knew him intimately and had worked with him, and looking at Wilson's own writing and speeches, realized that Wilson did have a very serious neurosis well before he became president of the United States. And so Wilson was the president of Princeton University, again, a very vindictive man, was then placed in a political position within a state, and in less than 2 years was then fronted as the candidate for the Democratic Party against the double ticket, right? So in other words, there was Taft, and then Teddy Roosevelt had split away from the Republican Party to create the Bull Moose Party, the radical left version of the Republicans, and then you had Wilson. So the Republican ticket was divided, and then the Democrats were able to, only for the second time since Grover Cleveland, put a man in president, and that was Woodrow Wilson. However, Woodrow Wilson, as I said, needed a very close friend. He needed a wife, he needed a female companion, and then he needed one or maybe two close confidants, and then he could go out, and he said it would steal his nerves. And House was that man. House had actually vetted him and suggested that he is the one that should be on the Democratic ticket for the president of the United States. Now, House, Edmund House, is another factor that we have to look into. He was pretty much the beginning or one of the first Texas fixers. Everyone knows later on it was Lyndon Baines Johnson is the one that we tend to remember now as one of the big political bosses that came out of Texas. But before Lyndon Baines Johnson and others, there was Edmund House. And he understood presidential cradles, which states, which regions, which groups became what he called presidential cradles, and how to manipulate that power to gain a presidency. And he tested it with Wilson, and he was successful. He later on went on to advise Franklin Delano Roosevelt, maintained his presence within the political party, the Democrat political party, and kind of helped engineer Franklin Delano Roosevelt's returning the Democrats to the White House, and specifically a very leftist neo-fascist group of the Democrats, the Democratic Party, and policies that were implemented to America that we still have today. So House wrote a book in 1911, and the book is remarkable. So we're going to take a look at that now. And looking at the book, again, this was printed initially anonymously, as I said before. But in the seeds of this book, the plot is essentially that there's a person he calls the administrator, and it was a guy named Philip Drew. So that's the protagonist of the story. And Philip Drew initially is in the United States military. He's a West Point graduate, but he's very unhappy with the military. And we can see a couple of things in here. I'll describe the plot, and then we'll kind of go into some of the themes and the revelations about what's going on in House's head and how he sees the future of America, how he sees America at the time, and where he sees that he can so-called fix America at that time. So what happened was that there's, in his story, there's Philip Drew, administrator, who's in the military, but quite unhappy. He meets a love interest, and the love interest convinces him to leave the military. And they do this based on going out into the desert. They get lost near death. He brings her back heroically, and then decides, I'm going to get out of the military, and I'm going to pursue saving America via social political means. So he gets out of the military. Him and the woman team up. And then from there, they actually split up. He says, okay, we're going to split up, And you reach out to the rich people because you're from that upper class. You're from the ruling class. I want you to convince the rich people. Don't worry about the poor people. The poor people will follow the rich people. Keep that in mind. So in Philip Drew Administrator, the key to success is you convince the rich about your socialistic plans, your fascistic plans. And then once they've bought into it, then you'll get the poor people to follow, because the poor people will follow the money. It's a pretty good control model, and kind of what we're dealing with, or at least what people notice that you're dealing with lately when corporations come out with various programs that are seem to be counter to business models, but they're actually political, social shaping models, and people just tend to follow along. Why? Because the money is there. So they do this. Then there's after he's established about a 5-year program to penetrate within America. And during that time, Philip Drew is meeting political people. He's moving around. He's understanding the nature of politics and economics in America. He then gets involved in a presidential race. So there's a presidential race between two people. And here we see a very interesting thing. There's some foreshadowing about real life. So yes, it's fiction, but this is, again, House talking through in fictional form what he's formulating right now and doing. And you'll see he actually talks about vetting both Roosevelt or Wilson, and which one should he back for the presidency. Or that he says that'll be the people that will fix America toward this kind of fascistic, socialistic goal that he has, this new structure of society. There's a presidential runoff or a presidential race. They know how to manipulate votes, and there's a turncoat. Ostensibly doesn't say it, but from what he describes as the Republican side, the ruling side, who's ruled forever and has kept down the neo-Confederate or the unreconstructed South, Southerners. And so there's this clash. Philip Drew takes these generals and takes kind of this angst from this, what essentially we could say is the Democratic South. And then there's actually another civil war, second civil war that he undergoes. And then he takes over by this revolution, America, and they have a march on Washington. Remember, just like the march on Rome with the fascists. But again, this was well before that. It was simply will to power, that this was a military demonstration. And through that, he must have, it must be right. God must have blessed him because he has the victory. So therefore he's right. And so they march on Washington. He takes over the federal government and has very draconian means, and pretty much tears up the Constitution and says, in order to fix this, I need dictatorial powers. And they call it administrator. They say dictatorial one moment, and then they change it to administrator. It's a very American marketing kind of way to do things, which we will we'll learn about here right after this. And the American people go along with it. And then he pretty much trashes the Constitution. It's a council of experts that run everything. And then he redoes Congress. So they basically don't have power. Most of the power is in the executive through these councils of experts. And then he runs the world. And then supposedly after a couple of terms, America's on its cruise control. Now he resigns and walks out into the desert like a prophet, right? Because all people who gain power just walk out willingly from that power. That's very, very theoretical, but that's it in a nutshell. And so you can already see that the man that installed Wilson is already looking at a dictatorial, oligarchical, kind of a fascist America is what he's looking at. And he does it by force, right? They're looking at moving in by force and convincing people how to do things. There's a lot of doublespeak. I mean, 1984, George Orwell hadn't been done yet. The Bolshevik Revolution hadn't occurred. Mussolini's March on Rome had not occurred. The Beer Hall Putsch, the Nazis, in fact, they hadn't even really formed at this point at all. They hadn't combined the National Socialist Deutsches Abteilung with the National Socialists. So all of these communist movements are still in theoretical phases, and House definitely channels those ideas that were brewing and makes it into a U.S. ideal. In fact, he mentions that it is socialism, but they understood in the American version of socialism, this kind of this kind of corporate socialism, that it's not efficient. So the European version of socialism, communism, isn't efficient because people are going to be lazy and take advantage of it. So you have to convince them in their mind it has to be like a cult. It has to be more of a religious thing, that they want to do it through social pressure, right? In other words, they keep this socialistic jihad going based on a mindset. It has to be a religious fervor that keeps you going, so you'll be inefficient and you're not going to waste things. So he wasn't. It wasn't a worker's paradise. It was just in your mind, you're going to imagine this. So let's go ahead and take a look at this and start to examine some of these, the chapters in here, which are very revealing. The first thing is House didn't like the military. He thought the military was stupid. He makes a couple of references in here about how Philip Drew, when he was in the military, was much too smart for the military, understood geopolitics, which was unusual, he says, for the military. So that's kind of interesting. So he definitely looked down upon the army, and we can see that here. We also see that there is a lot of kind of a Christian reference. Now, this will surprise some people that grew up in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s, where evangelical Christians were kind of the representative in popular culture of what Christians were, and they were solidly Reagan Republicans, right? So in most people's minds of a certain age group within the United States and indeed the world, in some places, Christianity is equivalent to conservatism. However, there was a long trend of a socialist Christian, a communist, Christian communist that were not just in Europe or not just in Asia. In fact, in Japan, a lot of the Christian movements are still very much tied into communist movements. But we see in America, there was also this movement. Now, what he does is he'll take the imagery and the metaphors of Christianity, kind of the trappings of Christianity, and infuses it in this new religion. And he explains why later on, but in the beginning, he's already seeding that with it, that this is kind of you have to do this because this is charity. This is a form of your Christian charity, your Christian duty. But, we can't trust you with it, so the government has to do it and enforce it to you, right? Which really isn't charity, but, there it is. And again, when you look through this, you'll see that some of these in different forms were implemented by Woodrow Wilson. That was his mindset, his kind of mind that was going through there. But remember, it was also a later Teddy Roosevelt. So the new nationalist party or the new nationalist ideal that Teddy Roosevelt was pushing also borders and mirrors a lot of this same kind of statism structure that they were looking at. So like in here, so right away he starts putting this kind of Christian metaphor in there, and it says, nowhere in the world is wealth more defiant. And he's defining the problem, right? Why do you have to fix the problem of America? And so this is one of the ones that he mentions right away to do that. So he says, nowhere in the world is wealth more defiant, monopoly more insistent than in this mighty republic, he said. And it is here that the next great battle of human emancipation will be fought and won. And from the blood and travail of an enlightened people, there will be born a spirit of love and brotherhood, which will transform the world. So they're already talking about a global revolution, right? So America will be a global revolution with this fascist, socialist, kind of idea. And the star of Bethlehem, seen but darkly for 2,000 years, will shine again with the steady and effulgent glow. So he's giving the star of Bethlehem. So he's saying that basically, Christ is a communist, right? And there were those that had that, right? Give unto Caesar what Caesar is due, and that was seen as you had to do that. The poverty you had to individually go poverty because the collective, you had to share your wealth with collective. So this wasn't new, but he was updating it into a modern age, using a government and modern means to be able to do that. And so that's kind of what he's looking at there. There were other groups that did this in America, but this is kind of part of that movement, and we can see that got instilled later on. Woodrow Wilson used that same iconography, especially in Versailles. It was noted by Clemenceau and the other Lord Grey and those that met and had to deal with Wilson in the Versailles area in France after World War I, and noted that he was almost messianic in his view in that. In fact, I'll take a break here to talk real quick about one of the other characteristics of Wilson and his kind of his messianic belief that he was kind of it's my way or the highway, right? In other words, he was the only one with the only truth and the only way forward. So when Woodrow Wilson and House was a large part of of Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. House pushed him into foreign policy. Wilson was just going to think domestics. House was the one saying worldwide revolution through the Versailles Treaty, through this League of Nations that House had pretty much frameworked. So they were looking at this, and the Republicans in the Congress said, look, okay, we'll agree to the League of Nations, but only if you put within that charter, the League Charter, that the America will have to defer to Congress to declare war, right? In other words, the traditional power to declare war rested with Congress, not the executive. So we need to make sure that's in there, that you can't bypass the Constitution and go declare war on whoever. Now, later on, we did get that with the war powers that kind of crept in there, that the president could declare war or use basically everything except declaring war, but use the mechanisms of state, which is essentially a war in everything but name. But at the time, that was very important that Congress was the only one that could declare war. And Wilson got so upset, and the Europeans agreed to it. The Europeans said, okay, fine, for America, there'll be a clause in there saying that, okay, Congress has to declare war in order for the United States to be able to come in and support the League. We got it, no problem. We'll work with you. We don't want to do anything bad to your Constitution. But Woodrow Wilson said, no. And literally, because he was stuck on the executive will go to war, right? Unconstitutionally, he was wanting to tear this up. He was wanting to be a Philip Drew, as you'll see later. and he kiboshed the whole thing. In other words, if he had just compromised on that, America would have been officially in the League of Nations. We were, to some other degree, with supporting programs. We're unofficially in the League, and we were shaping things economically, definitely overseas and in Europe. But that's the kind of guy Wilson was, my way or the highway. And he talked in these terms of, this is the will of heaven, so to speak, in the way that he was doing things. So he fully believed in a kind of a religious socialism that was the way forward for America. And it was because that the wealth had not been spread around. So he is talking in terms of economics, but they didn't want to create a class war. That's the difference between European Marxism and American Marxism that was implemented, was that American Marxism needed to retain the oligarchy, and it didn't want a class war. So it wanted to retain the structure, but it wanted to stop the clock. Nobody else can move up or down. We're going to freeze everybody in their social structure and then implement socialism, right? So the oligarchs like the Rockefellers and the Morgans and that sort of thing that have their power, they're going to retain it, right? But everybody else, you need to kind of go and do that sort of, you need to do your charity because you're kind of locked in there, right? So basically it's corporate socialism, right? Corporations don't want competition once they get up there, right? So if the government has locked it, game over, everybody freeze, we got it, they're good to go. So that's kind of what the was going on at that time. But let's go ahead and return to House here and look a little bit of it. So again, here's more of that kind of that Christian reference of the Christian communism that was a stream within the United States society. So it says the first gleam of hope came from the advent of Christ. He continued, so warped and tangled had become in the minds of men, the meaning of Christ's teaching failed utterly to reach human comprehension. They accepted him as a religious teacher only so far as their selfish desires led them. They were willing to deny other gods and admit one creator of all things, but they split into fragments regarding the creeds and forms necessary to salvation. In the name of Christ, they committed atrocities that would be put to blush the most benighted savages. The very excesses and cruelty finally caused a revolution in feeling, and there was evolved a Christian religion of today, a religion almost wholly selfish and concerned almost entirely in the betterment of life after death. So what is he saying? He's saying for 2,000 years, every Christian thing which believed in the salvation of the individual, or sometimes a country, depending, but basically an individual, that you go to heaven, right? So you need to perfect yourself and go up there. What he's saying is, no, that's not it. For 2,000 years, that's not it. It's not a religious thing. It's a cultural that everybody has to kind of work together, and you'll see that later on. So you see the framework here. In other words, this is a religious duty, and nobody understands Christianity for 2,000 years, but I'm going to show you Christianity through socialism, right? So that, and again, merging this religion, this charity, using or kind of co-opting a Christian ethic into socialism was very unique or not unique, but it was very powerful in America. And that's where Wilson kind of pushed it forward. And that was where it began to move within the United States. So, it's infinite love, the sweet humility, the gentle charity, the subordination of self that the master came to give a cruel, selfish, and ignorant world mean but little to us today than those whom he gave it. So again, this shows that kind of socialistic belief in, a Christianity that's socialism. All right, so enough of that. This is the Lost in the Desert, so it kind of gives them that messianic feel, right? So like, Moses leading everyone through the desert, like Jesus Christ, the Christian, walking through the desert. He does the same thing, right? So he's lost in the desert. So he's giving him kind of this messianic narrative story. So his hero's journey kind of mirrors more religious figures. And again, he kind of, blots out the military. He says, when I was leading you out of the desert, a blind man, it may be that I was leading you out of the barrenness of military life into a fruitful field of labor for humanity. So that was his love interest there that was kind of, saying, hey, you're out of the military now. You can't help people in the military, but you can help them in the field of humanity if you're outside the military. So House didn't have a nice view of the military whatsoever. Again, going back more into it, this is from page 20. So it says, now man at last is about to enter the splendid kingdom, the promise of which Christ gave to us when he said, my Father and I are one. And again, when you have seen me, you have seen the Father. He was but telling them that all life was part of the one life, individualized, but yet and part of the whole. Now, philosophically, that's correct in different groups, but they're framing it in terms they're going to change this this ideal into a socialist ideal, right? So economically, we have to be dependent upon everybody around there, and that sort of thing within the nation. So that's kind of interesting. They can measurably conquer troubles by force of mind, and then you'll also see in here they start to talk about transforming the mind, right? Kind of a interesting bit here. Again, creating kind of a cult. And he says, you see, I am greatly interested in this movement, which is seeking to find how far mind controls matter and to what extent the lives are spiritual rather than material. So when fear, hate, greed, and the purely material conception of life passes out, said Philip, as someday it may, and only wholesome thoughts will have a place in human minds, mental ills will take flight along with most of our bodily ills, and the miracle of the world's redemption will have been largely wrought. Then, too, we should be trained not to have such an unreasonable fear of death. The Eastern peoples are far wiser than we are in their respect. If that be true, there is no death as we have conceived it. It would mean to us merely the beginning of a more splendid day. So, you're almost getting into kind of that doomsday thing. Like, your life doesn't mean anything. Don't be afraid of death. Keep your thoughts pure and just go forward. So in other words, he's setting them up for basically being a slave. Your life isn't yours. You have to give. This is your duty. It's a better world beyond, but only if you do this sort of socialism on earth, as you'll see here in a minute. But notice he's already setting up the seeds that you need to be like what he says, the Eastern people. Just don't worry about life. Don't worry about death, right? You're going to a better thing. Give up on that. And then the other thing, that somehow wholesome thoughts will lead to a peaceful world that will overcome your innate biology about how humans react under all situations, no matter what, is a little far-fetched. Again, very utopian, but that was kind of the mood of that time, and even now. And sometimes he didn't understand. He understood very well political animals, but in selling this idea, he was going for some kind of pie in the sky. Now, this may have been written specifically for Wilson, and Wilson had that kind of belief that people could be, perfected in some way by just their mental acuity. But so that there is that possibility that House knew that this was BS, but he was putting it in here for Wilson. So how much of this was being communicated to Wilson as kind of a manual or a how-to guide? How much of this was for the inner circle versus general consumption? I'm not sure, but it's definitely doesn't match. and House was smart enough in moving people around politically that he knew human nature. So keeping going in here, that he's talking about, my purpose to consecrate my life toward the betterment of such as these, our thoughts, our habits, our morals, our civilization itself is wrong. Else it would not be possible for this sort of suffering to exist. In other words, because they're suffering, it's, some kind of flaw in the system. Not that suffering is inevitable. We can reduce the suffering. You're never going to eliminate it. It's the nature of physics, right? If you fall out of a building, you're going to get hurt or die. Is that a just world? Probably not, but that's physics, right? That's what happens. The poor, the weak, and the impractical do not themselves bring about their condition, right? If the powerful use their strength merely to further their own selfish desires, in what way, save the degree, can they differ from the lower animals of creation? And how can man, under such a moral code, justify his dominion over land and sea? Until recently, this question was never squarely faced in the human race. It will not be called charity, but it will be known as justice. And the man or woman who failed to do his duty, not as he sees it, but as a society at large sees it, will be held up to contempt of mankind. A generation or two ago, Gloria, the mad unreasoning scramble for wealth began. So he was already saying in here that you're going to use kind of social pressures to convince people that they have to give up. They have to give up their wealth. They have to give up their things because you have to give to the poor, right? So in other words, they're forcing this wealth transfer. Again, not from any oligarch group, but just from the middle class, so to speak, or the ones that are not within the political clique, as you'll see later. But he goes into, that sort of thing, but he's going to use the social pressure against people that they're there. And it says it's not charity, it's justice. So again, he's corrupting the idea and the concept of what the charity is. It should be a voluntary, right? In other words, otherwise it's a tax, it's a duty, it's a tithe. I just have to give it anyway. A charity is above and beyond, which you normally have to give. But again, he may come from a different tradition, whatever he was raised at within Texas. Interestingly, Woodrow Wilson, as a side note, his father was a very religious person, but he was very abusive to Wilson. And there's a lot of need for Wilson to have not just a female with him that kind of replaces the mother, but kind of a strong guiding male that's a close confidant, because he had a lot of father issues that he was trying to resolve. And so House, probably knowing that, was putting some of this language in here to kind of manipulate and shape Wilson to comply with some of these things. Now, here, remember I said that that House was talking about in this book, the vetting process that he was going through. So it gives a little clue what his process was doing. There were some publishers, like I said, 1923, that published in their forward to the book. They knew who this author was. He was still anonymous at that time, but they knew who the author was of this book. And they said, okay, we get to peek behind the scenes and what's going on in that. And here is where he talks about either Woodrow Wilson or Teddy Roosevelt being the guy that will be able to fix all this. And of course, in here, he does it as Philip Drew, which is kind of the idealized. So, and he talks about this, this is the world is bad. This is terrible. Everybody's corrupt. There's no savior going to come from them, but there's only two people that are good examples of that. And it's interesting. So these are the two examples of good men in this world of this country of messed up, broken toys, as he kind of puts it. One such, so he says it here, there's men that are gifted that don't want to acquire wealth or power. They labor diligently in their separate fields of endeavor. One such became a great educator, the greatest of his day and generation, and by his long life of rectitude set an example for the youth of America that has done more good than all the gold and all the millionaires have given for educational purposes. He's talking about Woodrow Wilson. Next one is another brought to success a prodigious physical undertaking. For no further reason that he might serve his country where best he could, he went into a fever-laden land and dug a mighty ditch, bringing together two great oceans and changing the commerce of the world. That's Teddy Roosevelt, right? Bringing the Panama Canal. So he's talking about these two as the only examples of good, right? So my theory is even if Roosevelt had been elected, he was already kind of vetted and he was on board the same kind of boat that this kind of new American insurgency was going on, but it was a quiet insurgency, right? So the March on Washington, D.C. in this book was done with military units. In reality, it was done quietly with lawyers, with changes in law, with financing, with taxes, and that sort of thing. So the organizational structure was very quiet because they had managed to put pretty much Wilson had this guidebook and he had House guiding him in order to circumvent the Constitution to get their goals. All right. Moving forward, now we're going to talk about how they look at socialism, Marxism, communism, and they said, that's the way forward, but it's inefficient. It's not going to work. Why? Because people will eventually ride the coattails of other people, right? It spurs on kind of a sloth, a laziness, right? You have to maintain productivity, but how do you do that? And so this is them talking about it and literally saying it. So this comes from Marxian principles. Their ideas about the perfect society is based in kind of an efficient corporate socialist Marxism. And so we'll go into here and it says, for the moral tone, the thought the world is changing. Mankind is awakening to the fact, I believe that mankind is awakening to the fact that material compensation is far less to be desired than spiritual compensation. This feeling will grow. So they're going back to this. It's just kind of, moving here. And it says up here, but how can there be a more even distribution of wealth without lessening the efficiency of the strong, able, and energetic man, and without making mendicants of the indolent and improvident? If we had pure socialism, we could never get the highest endeavor out of anyone, for it would seem not worth the while to do more than the average. The race would then go backward instead of lifting itself higher, and the instant desire to excel and reap the rich reward that comes with success. Moving down, socialism, this is important. A little pen here. All right. So we can see this one. So socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx cannot be entirely brought about by the comprehensive system of state ownership and by the leveling of wealth. If that were done without a spiritual leavening, the result would be largely as you suggest. So he says, okay, this is not going to work, but he says we need a spiritual leavening and then it's going to work. So you have to do the spiritual leavening to get people to buy into it subconsciously through this kind of religious order. So it's kind of like, these utopians that were set up, at various places in the United States. I think there were 6 or 7 in Washington state up here. And these were actually set up, some of them along kind of pseudo-religious lines, or their cults would create their own little utopia. And that way everybody buys in, right? Because they're true believers in what they were doing. But we can see that. So we definitely now have this Marxian kind of basis, but with an efficiency, right? A corporate socialism that they're kind of moving through there. So somebody's making a profit. Now, going through into this one. Okay, so this is actually for another one. All right, so this is kind of points to, yes, this is socialism, yes, this is fascism. So we have the clues here, but okay, that's the theory, but how are they going to start to implement this thing? So we're now talking about Philip Drew moving forward and getting now a political career. He's about to get involved. He's learning, he's moving around. In a direct and forceful manner, he pointed out, Philip Drew, that our civilization was fundamentally wrong inasmuch as the other things it restricted efficiency. That if society were properly organized, there would be none who were not sufficiently clothed and fed, that the laws, habits, and ethical trading in vogue were alike responsible for the inequalities in opportunity and the consequent wide difference between the few and the many, and the result of such conditions was to render inefficient a large part of the population. So if you look at some of the Gentile and Mussolini, what they're writing about when they wrote fascism, it was making things efficient because the situation, the economic situation, the mobilization of industry, of agriculture, of the distribution was inefficient and needed to be central control, right? So that was a part and parcel of what fascism was. And some state planning was what it was. And so the state has to come in and efficiently organize these things. You can't leave that up to the people. The state has to come in order to maximize that, which is fascism, right? Statism. To each according to his own right. So he says their opportunity to accomplish that for which it is best fitted. Their bodies will be properly clothed and fed at a minimum amount of exertion. So that may mean something more than a mere struggle for existence. So in other words, we're going to feed and clothe everyone. There's going to be kind of a standard issue for everyone. And then you can go to work, right? So you're not struggling for work. You're going to be working for us, right? You're not going to struggle to get your clothes. We'll give you the clothes and that sort of thing. So they're not doing it quite out of generosity. You notice they're taking it in terms of efficiency. Not that, hey, I feel sorry for you, so we're going to give charity, right? It's no. We're going to reorganize the state, and we're going to give it to you so you can now be efficient, right? So, again, it's quite interesting. The problem of the foreigner and the immigrant into this country is that effect upon our national life. In the second article, he incorporated the story of Levinsky's being fairly represented the problem he wished to treat. So he says that the problem was that the foreigner was working too hard and getting too much money, right? So, and that they were not contributing to society. Now, the foreigners at that time were mostly Eastern Europeans, actually, at the turn of the century. And so that's what he was looking at. Earlier in the chapter, he was staying with a Jewish couple, the Levinskys. He was boarding in their house upstairs, and he noticed that they were working, but they weren't charitable, right? Which in Judaism, if they were Orthodox or Eastern Europeans, they're charitable, but within their synagogue, right? They don't need big public things that go out. If you're German Reform Judaism that had been here for a long time, well, they were pretty big on charity. So in this time, a lot of the tenement houses, a lot of the Ostjuden or the Eastern Jews that came over from Russia, which were different than the Reform-minded German and Western European Jews, there was actually a big culture clash between them, were different. So what he's describing is the Eastern European Jew that was trying to move their way up. But they were required by Jewish law to give charity to the temple or to their shul, so that kind of thing. So, but he's saying that's indicative, right? So in other words, they have to kind of break up the immigrant class and get them on board with this kind of socialistic idea, right? Which is funny because years later, a lot of them were actually bringing over these socialistic ideas. So there's kind of a disconnect in how House saw some of the Eastern Europeans at that time. But again, Italians, French were more of the promoting communism. It wasn't so much coming from the Eastern European. Russia hadn't taken the lead yet. It was still a French-led communism, was still primarily French. And then the Italians were kind of taking anarchic communism forward. So let's keep going here. So now we're going to move on. And this is where I talked about Gloria is the love interest. But this is where they kind of move out. So he says, you've got to go convince the rich in order for this thing to work, right? It's not a bottom-up revolution. It's not the proletariat versus the bourgeois. It's not, workers unite, Arbeiterbund. This is literally, okay, you got to convince the rich, and then the poor are going to follow rich because they're following the money. So it's a little different, but the same effect, right? Statism and that sort of thing. So it's quite interesting. Said the most important thing is to be done not among the poor, but among the rich, right? This is where you become a forceful missionary for good. All of us can reach the poor, for they welcome us, but there are only a few who think like you who can reach the rich and powerful, because she came from an upper class family. Let's see. Let that be your field of endeavor. He's talking to Gloria, so he's telling his love interest, let's separate for 5 years. It's going to be platonic, and you go do your thing, because that's what we're sacrificing for this movement. Do your work gently and with moderation, so that some at least may listen. If we would convince them to convert, we must veil our thoughts and curb our enthusiasm so that those we would influence will think us reasonable. So in other words, don't tell them what we're doing. I want you to be reasonable. I want you to change the language. I want you to kind of veil what you're saying so that they'll buy into it, right? So it's kind of Marxism, right? You're going to change the meaning, you're change the lines, you're going to do a lot of propaganda to be able to convince the rich that this is in their interest and they're going to do this thing, so we can get them on board, right? Not telling the truth. Is this really something? It's really kind of sneaky in there. So we have seen the true path, again, to your destiny. So a lot of words in here that, again, this is kind of a religious, kind of a messianic socialist movement that goes through that he's describing here. And again, this may have been to convince Wilson, right? This may have been getting inside Wilson's head because Wilson had that. I mean, how much did House know about Wilson? That still needs to be looked at. He had a tremendous diary. That's volumes and volumes, like over 30 books, I believe, on Wilson, because he would just, every day he would write his diary, and there's prolific diary. And that's, again, what Sigmund Freud looked at and kind of figured out he had a pretty bad neurosis, but about his father. Is this mirroring language that Wilson knew about his father, that his father was kind of this impassioned, we need to solve the ills of America through, religion, or through this ideal that he was selling? Maybe. I mean, that's a possibility, right? So if you know who influences people behind you, right? Remember in the beginning, Themistocles, right? Our infant son controls the mother. Well, if I can make something that's you're responding to in that infant son, if I can mirror that or mimic that, you're going to respond to that, right? So in other words, if you understand the power behind the throne, what influenced Wilson was his dad and the memories of his dad and the thoughts and the words and the attitudes of his dad. He had dad issues. If you can put something in there that reminds him of his father, then you've got him, right? So did House do that? We don't know, but that's something I'll definitely be looking into now that I've seen this. So going in this, so for 5 years they go out. During that time, there's a big election. One of the interesting things is what they're doing, right? So basically, use of false opposition. So this is, remember the Uniparty? They basically build false opposition. He's talking about how they do that so that people think that there's a solution, right? So they'll create a problem, but they're going to benefit from it. The people get upset. Well, when they do, they front their candidate out front and say, okay, here's the guy, and they pretend to fight, right? Kayfabe, I believe, is kind of the word that people use in wrestling. They do kind of a fake fight, and then guess what happens? Nothing is ever really done because they control the opposition and they get profit from no matter who wins and which way it goes. So if you control all the players, if you control both sides of the chessboard, you're going to win. It's a win-win for you, right? The poor pawns are going to lose, but it's a win-win for you. So that's what they're talking in here. So the Uniparty is nothing new, putting up, false fronts and controlled opposition, nothing new. This is a technique that was in use back then, and House knew about it. And he's giving us a little peek behind the scenes as to what a political fixer and a political boss was dealing with normally in elections in the early 20th century. So, and we're still dealing with it today. Now, again, here's some references to Wilson kind of ushering this man in. So it's kind of interesting that, how he does this. So he's talked about Roosevelt, but then he doesn't talk about Roosevelt. He talks about the white-haired professor, the college president, bringing him in. There's quiet, very diligent. So he's kind of writing in a character that Wilson would have some sympathy with, in addition to being kind of a Philip Drew type of person. Did Wilson secretly want to be kind of Marshall? I don't know. Because he got out of the military, but he still led a revolution. This is basically, yeah. So they created committees. It was a government by committee. They would form committees of experts, and then there was no halting until the government was again within their hands. The head of a committee to perfect not only the state but a national organization as well. So, these committees were doing, and you see these committees of the elects. Let's see. Let's go forward here. They contended that in prosecuting capital against various assaults, they were serving the cause of labor and advancing welfare of all. So in other words, they can co-opt capital, they can co-opt the money because the ends justify the means. So anything was okay to do. They were doing violence. They even said later on, once they took power, if there's any opposition, that they're going to you're going to die. Like they said it, you're going to be executed, right? So, but that's okay because the ends justify the means. And again, this is up there. So there's a civil war between the political parties. Like I said, Drew comes up there and grabs it in there. They keep talking about this utopian world that they're going to do. With money, we can overthrow the opposition. So they understood that you need to amass a lot of capital, and toward that, Gloria's in there getting all the rich on board. So they're going to have a number of things in there. They openly admit they're a progressive or insurgent cause. Again, this was what the terms were for Teddy Roosevelt's group, and then eventually the progressive cause was seen to be also Wilson's. So we have this kind of uniparty or groups within both Republicans and Democrats looking for the same kind of thing. So in other words, here, they don't like the use of guns except by a militia. So, do away with the Second Amendment, just intrinsically. And this is another thing. So he never references, this is very important. He never ever references the American Revolution or the founding fathers. He never says we need to correct the Constitution or we need to fix or complete the revolution that the American founding fathers put in there, right? It was an incomplete revolution because we didn't do away with slavery. In fact, what he says in here is that actually the best person, his ideal person, is actually a plantation owner. No kidding. They made it. Gloria meets an old plantation owner, says, "There's the perfect human being, right? If all people could be like this soul." uh-huh. And he talks about that the South, basically the Neo-Confederacy will kind of rise again, because he saw the emancipation of Black Americans as their downfall. He says literally they're like children. He says it here, they're like children, and we need to be controlling of them. Like literally, it's the old, well, we treated the slaves like children on our plantations. And so there's a page in here. This is really long. I'll go into it probably later, or actually I would recommend get the book. It's online now because the copyright's gone. But basically you can go through there and you can see how he's talking about basically bringing the South to power and doing some reconciliation from the Civil War, for the honor of the South, right? Not for, they were economically depressed and the North kind of kept them down a little bit. But literally that was a problem. But what he talks about is that, this is interesting. So we see from contrast. So what works right? America's horrible. America's horrible. He references the French Revolution, right? He says that there was born in the French Revolution this glorious star, giving it kind of a religious appeal, liberty. And he says in here, we have to have liberty, equality, fraternity, right? Not all men are created equal. No, liberty, eternity, or liberty, fraternity, equality, which is the battle cry of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, which had oddly taken God out of Enlightenment principles, right? The difference between the American and the French Revolution is the American Revolution instilled God or a higher power that says these rights are yours, right? And the government can't take them away. The government has to protect the rights. French Revolution essentially says the state gives you your rights and we can take them away if we need to, right? Big difference, and a big difference in outcome, right? So you see the terror of the revolution. Revolution went on for decades, and the counter-revolutions and more counter-revolutions on counter-revolutions within France. And you see a lot of suffering of the French people for a very long time because they didn't have that kind of guiding bedrock, whereas the Americans did. There are other factors in there. But the fact that House will not reference the American Revolution, but the French Revolution is kind of the model, that's a problem. What else does he use as a model for this is the British and management of their colonies in South Africa during the Boer War. Remember, the British put people in concentration camps. The first concentration camps in mass in a large thing was the British to the South Africans, the Afrikaners, during the Boer War. I think it was, depending on the numbers, tens of thousands. The accuracy of that we have to examine, and I haven't examined that personally, so I'm not going to make a quote on it. But roughly, we can safely look at tens of thousands of civilians were killed in these concentration camps by the British. Malnutrition, disease, some executions. So that was going on, and he cites that this is a good thing, right? So this isn't a peaceful guy. This isn't pie in the sky kind of stuff. This is kind of a guy that at the back of it doesn't have power, but once he gets power, he's going to be fairly brutal. And America was brutal to a certain extent in what they did in some of the later areas. So let's look at this. On the other hand, within a few years after the African Revolution ended, a Boer general who had fought throughout the war with vigor and distinction was proposed and elected premier of the United Colonies. Now he's talking about Jan Smuts, but what he doesn't say is that Jan Smuts was actually working for the British. So of course he's going to get placed and done in there. So he's saying that the South was kept down because the South had no president, right? Except for kind of Grover Cleveland, but that wasn't considering. He says there's something wrong with that, right? You should have had a Southern president. Okay, and so that was kind of his pushing for these sorts of things. So he lauds the British in South Africa despite the genocide and ethnic cleansing, concentration camps. Yeah, we talked about that. Also, House, he didn't refer to the American Revolution. Yeah, we got that. And so, so you got this guy who's a Francophobe and kind of an Anglophobe, and he's talking about reshaping America. So he's talking about reshaping America in the European mold, and specifically a socialist model with kind of a religious fervor to it. Let's go forward here a little bit. Let's talk about, so again, just laced with a lot of the religious kind of ideas in there. Judgment seat of God. So you have to become an iconoclast and accept the consequences. Doesn't matter what tradition or history had said. You keep going. So here it is with the I mentioned earlier about the plantation owner. They met an old plantation owner. Philip, that man you mentioned is doubtless the most splendid product of our civilization, right? It's plantation owners, the most splendid product of our civilization. So you can kind of see where they come in. Woodrow Wilson, as you know, kind of allowed the revitalization of the KKK 2.0. He resegregated the federal government. So he moved Black Americans out of the federal government, resegregated that. He screened The Birth of a Nation in the White House, was the first film in the White House, and said, it was like electric lightning. He had high praise for it. So there's a lot of wanting to go kind of the lost causes now is, stuck in the White House. Let's go forward. Yeah. So here it says right here, right? So he calls his officers together, and now that he's about to do the march in Washington, he's getting power. He says he's going to assume the powers of a dictator, but then they call it an administrator of the republic. But essentially, it's a dictator, right? So euphemistic words, but it's basically a dictator. And again, that kind of that fascist means by force, they're going to take it. And yeah, so this is basically they're going to, keep the mob, the crowd, the mob, the anger is going to keep in line everyone, because the thrill of fear among those who would not have liked to raise their voices in protest. So the mob will keep them quiet. And if they don't, then they're going to get killed. Right. So again, very fascist. In other words, and we did it because it would take over a century of public education to change people around to this ideal. So they did it in force. And they actually have 12 men who are going to take charge of the departments and act as advisors. They do away with everything. They set up councils of experts. They bring over European lawyers to redo the American Constitution. They bring over European financiers to redo the American Constitution. And so, quite interesting. So what happened? Well, we had the Fed under Wilson, which is European kind of way. And then he was gradually, and especially Roosevelt, they were trying to change America to be the executive driven for, bypass Congress. FDR was trying to bypass the Supreme Court, pack the Supreme Court at one point. So there's all of this going on that mirrors this. So in other words, FDR's goals, Woodrow Wilson's goals mirror a lot of what's in here organizationally structured. Even though this is a fiction, it's what you need to do. Set up a council of experts, and those guys run you. Marginalize Congress, put a lot more power in the executive to get things done, because we need to do it, because it's our God mission here. All right. So everyone will want to join the procession at once. No one will want to be left in the finger of scorn to accuse. And strangely enough, I believe would be the educated and the rich. In fact, the ones that are now the most selfish, that will be in the vanguard of the procession. So he's even saying, because of what Gloria, his love interest, was doing in proselytizing to the rich, because we can give the rich this benefit of kind of state protection against competition, as long as they, give to the right people, right? You give to the government, you give to the right people, then you can keep the rest. But they'll be in the vanguard of this procession, right? The ones that are most selfish during this period of time, the early 20th century, with the robber barons. But they'll be the most generous, and they'll be leading the vanguard to get everybody on board. And that's how the poor get in there. So almost the same thing. Again, you see some of the corporations now acting in, insane ways. Well, that's the same thing. The vanguard of this revolution will be the rich and the people that at those days were most selfish. We cannot help the poor. We cannot aid our neighbor. For if we do, we cannot keep our places in the unholy struggle for social equality within our little sphere. Let us go, Gloria, into the fresh air. It stifles me to think of this phase of our civilization. So in other words, you can't help the poor right now, because we're going to have to renovate everything. So it's just fascism. And again, here it is. This is the reformation of the judiciary. Council of 12, the administration placed one member in charge of each of the 9 departments and gave the other 3 special work that was continually arising. That's what runs the government, a council of 12. Those in happy conditions followed the Reconstruction in the South, right? So again, he mentions it again, right? So it's a big sticking point, was Reconstruction in the South. So he's correcting Reconstruction in the South. So how much of that is really for the poor of the United States, or how much of it is just redistributing wealth to give power to a Southern bloc? He had 5. Here we go. So one of his first acts as administrator was to call together 5 great lawyers who had no objectionable corporate or private practice, and to give them the task of defining the powers of all courts, both state and federal. They were not only to remodel court procedure, but to eliminate such courts as were unnecessary. This board was to give the practice before the courts, their relations to their clients, and the amount of character of their fees under certain conditions. They could no longer pass upon the constitutionality of laws, the function being merely to decide between litigants. So in other words, the Constitution was not going to be decided by judges. It's going to be decided purely on political motives, right? So whatever the whim of the dictator is, that's what the Constitution is going to say, right? Because the dictator speaks for the people. Remember that, right? According to their own idea. So we can see in here, trying to get rid of that, basically courts deciding judges that judges, both federal and state, were to be appointed for life, subject to compulsory retirement at 70 and forced retirement anytime 2/3 the vote of the House and majority vote of the Senate. Their appointment was to be suggested by the president or governor, as the case may be. So the governor picks the judges, the president picks the judges for the federal, governors pick the judges for the state, and it's for life. Wow, look at the power, right? So in other words, this is dictatorial power, and the dictators pick the power, right? And the governor who is in there picks the power. So this is just enforcing central dictatorial power. If they were national, if you didn't believe in the cause, you're going to be subject to fine and imprisonment, right? So in other words, if you criticize the government, community standards, right? So Drew selected another board of 5 lawyers, and to them he gave the task of building the procedure, or reforming legal procedure, and of pruning down the existing laws, both state and national, cutting out the obsolete and useless ones and rewriting those to recommend to be retained in plain and direct language, free from useless legal verbiage and understandable to ordinary citizen. Well, that's pretty good. Notice who he picks. He says, I want 3 eminent lawyers from England, Germany, and France, respectively, right? Again, globalist law he's looking at. So he says, forget American law, forget that. We want kind of a globalist look. He's now known as General Drew. So the administrator, they start calling him General. Again, Drew went to England, France, and Germany for the best men he could get as advisors to the board of the taxation. So again, he's making America Europe. And that's essentially what Wilson was doing, trying to enmesh us in European affairs, which he did. And he tried to get us in the League of Nations, but only because of his ego and neurosis did we not get into that and that sort of thing. He further directed that so there's a tax. Everybody has get taxed. So first Senate committee, Drew told them to consider every existing tax law obliterated to begin anew and construct a revenue system along the lines he indicated for municipalities, counties, states, and the nation. He did not contemplate, he said, the new law should embrace all taxes which the 3 first-named civil divisions would levy, but they should apply only where taxes related to the general government. Nevertheless, Drew was hopeful such a system would be devised as would render it unnecessary for either municipalities, counties, or states to require any further revenue. It's okay. So he's already balanced the budget right away. To further direct that a tax on realty, both in the country and the city, should be upon the following basement. Improvements in city property would be taxed at 1/5 their value, town or country 2/3 of that. So super high taxes. And he also has a death tax. And then he has kind of a capital gains tax in there a little bit. There's a gradual income tax. Now, remember when he wrote this, there was no income tax, right? So income tax was part of his control mechanism to keep people in line. And he wants a gradual income tax exempting no income whatsoever, right? The control is going to go all the way to, so is this really for the poor people? Remember, he kind of said it was for the poor. That's why we're doing it. But then halfway through, he goes, well, I can't make the poor wealthy. It's just not our thing. We got to reconstruct this for justice. We've gone away from that. Once I've sold you on the idea, you're emotionally involved. Now I'm going to change it, but your emotion's going to be the same because I can't be wrong. This emotion, I want to keep this emotion going. I'm doing good, right? And now he says, now you're going to get an income for everybody. So up to incomes up to $1,000 a year, Drew thought should bear merely nominal tax of 1/2 of 1%. So they're still being taxed. False returns, false swearing, or any subterfuge to defraud the government was to be punished by not less than 6 months or more than 2 years in prison. The board was further instructed to incorporate in their tax measure an inheritance tax clause graduated at the same rate as income tax and to safeguard it. Safeguard the defrauding of the government by gifts before death and other devices. So they're really going for the money, right? They're really going for the money, and they're not letting you do what you want with the money. But again, most of these things were actually implemented afterward, right? We have an income tax, we have a death tax. At some point with sales tax, you're paying everybody, no matter what your income, is still paying a tax. So that's quite interesting. Again, central government. Now here it is. So if you think this is socialist, again, this is American version of it. So it's a Christian corporatist socialism, right? Kind of a weird fascism. So the people were asked to curb their prejudices against corporation. It was promised in the future corporations would be honestly run and in the interest of stockholders and the public. So he's not doing away with it, right? So big corporations are oligarchs, but he's taxing it, right? So in other words, kind of stopping the clock. The central government runs everything, but we're going to allow these big corporations to kind of keep going, but we'll ensure that it's fair and the stockholders get their stuff. So again, they didn't want this class war. They just want to control. This is just fascism, right? Even though they're going to say all this fluffy bunny stuff, it's just fascism. And you see it. He's more honest in this than they were in real life with their pronouncements, or at least the ones that got carried forward. Again, the railroad problem, he goes into that. The measure is based upon the English, French, and German plans. So again, he's just trying to make America like Europe. Freedom of choice goes away, no competition. So the nation and state were to share in the form of earnings. The public would be benefited thereby. Public service corporations were taken over bodily by the national government. So nationalization of industries and that sort of thing. But again, who's shareholders, right? So if the government owns a business, who's the shareholder? Who decides who owns it, right? It's not the people. They were clear on that. So again, a lot of self-contradictions in here, but you can kind of see the intent. The interests want a government hedged the interests. So he's talking about other oligarchies. The interests want a government hedged by restrictions such as we've been living under. It's easy to know why with the example of last administration. And this one he's talking about Roosevelt and Taft, actually Taft. And he says, we can't do that. The government has to be unfettered. And he goes in here, and again, the examples. He says, the English people for a century or more have such directions or have had such direction as I now propose that you shall have. And for more than half a century, the French people have had like power. They have in no way abused it. And yet the English and the French electorate surely are not more intelligent or have better control or more sober judgment than the American citizenship. The French for a century have a great model society. So let's take a look at this, right? 1911. So what was going on in 1811, right? France was going through all kind of turmoil. I mean, from the French Revolution. So you look and see in 1799, you've got Robespierre that takes over. You have the Great Terror. Just after that, you have, again, revolutions, counter-revolutions. You have a dictator come in there, right? Napoleon. So you have all of these things going on. And he says that's good. Why? Because the power was central. You had a centralized power. You had, kind of this dictatorial, the system that supported a dictator or ruled by committee, a small unelected committee with the trappings of a democracy. And we'll get into that. So again, there's a lot more in here. I'll definitely direct you to it. And yeah, so the language. Now, once it gets there, it's like, well, the peons are just handling it. So, then he looks down upon them, and then he just walks off. So once everything's great, about 20 years goes by, and it walks off, and then everything's good to go. So that was his manifesto. That is the American version of the corporate Christian Communist Manifesto by the guy that put in Wilson and guided him and probably signed some of the paperwork and shaped the League of Nations and the Versailles Peace Treaty. And yet nobody talks about this, right? That's what's in his mind. The diaries bear this out. The policy mirrors this. The rhetoric matches what he puts in there, right? The actions match the words. And so that's kind of where we're at on this. Now, how did we get sold to this? Why didn't the Americans go, what's going on? Some did, some didn't. And that's where we're going to briefly go into this one. And actually with this, I would recommend a deeper look. Actually, with this book, I would recommend reading it with Rape of the Mind by Dr. Joost Meerloo, who had studied both Nazi mind, kind of large shaping of mass control of mind and thought, along with a communist who used the same procedures to be able to do and instill the same thing. And so those techniques that he points out in Rape of the Mind are, from a neuroscientist or a psychiatrist, a neuroscientist in Holland that had observed it and moved on. So that's a good book to look at. Propaganda was by Bernays. Like I said, he was the World War I propagandist that helped out Wilson a lot. That got Americans all, into everything. But at the same time that people forget that these were going overseas, there was a cultural genocide against German Americans at the same time. In fact, there was a non-German professor who was jailed for playing Beethoven, right? There were Germans that were actually lynched. There was over 800 German language papers in America in 1910. By 1918, I believe there were 3. Like I said, they were jailed. German language was pulled out of schools. Just a tremendous kind of thing. We didn't do this in the Spanish-American War. We didn't get rid of the Spanish language. We didn't sit there and say you can't, eat Mexican food. All of this sort of thing. You can't eat Spanish food. You can't say Spanish words. Take off Spanish street signs in California and Texas and New Mexico. There wasn't that backlash. But in World War II or World War I, I should say, there was that backlash. There were Germans that were interned, right? So much as we did the Japanese in World War II and Japanese Americans, we were doing similar to the Germans in World War I. Prohibition, there is some strong evidence that prohibition was actually enacted in part to reduce the financial ability of German Americans to contribute or to do political action. And they were mostly Northerners, actually. So most of the Germans were actually on the Union side in World War I, in the Civil War, which may have helped Wilson decide that he's going to enact these very draconian laws against the German Americans and destroy kind of what was that immigrant culture that was within Americans. And Roosevelt had the same thing. He didn't like German Americans because he called them hyphenated Americans. So he kind of singled out Irish and Germans for, his invective. He didn't like that culture. He didn't like the Irish over the Germans, which is very British. So both Teddy Roosevelt, even though he had spent time in Germany, tended to move more as an Anglophile as he got later in life. And Wilson was definitely, as you see from the book, even though he did mention, using the Germans, House, that they definitely chose sides more with the French and the British style of kind of their their kind of fascist view and their socialist view. The Propaganda is by Bernays, and it's a long book. I won't go too much into it, but I did want to mention a couple of things that really stand out. Number one was that anything can be used. So within what he's talking about, the structure of this book, like I said, World War I was supposed to be a war for democracy. World War II was as well. But if you look at it, no Indian that was under British rule could vote for the prime minister of Britain. They're not really a democracy, right? Who wasn't there? And the Soviet Union and Russia, Tsarist Russia and Soviet Union, they're not fighting. They don't have a democracy. So, what are you talking about? So two of the largest allies in both wars, actually, Russia and Britain, were not true democracies, as an American would understand it. Yet it was a war for democracy. So, and it was, in Germany was as much of a constitutional monarchy as was Britain, and arguably more than most of the allies that the United States had in both wars. In Imperial Germany, not Nazi Germany by any means, but in Imperial Germany, it was kind of ironic, and this is what we're talking about here. So his being able to kind of mobilize Americans was seen as, he saw it as, you have to continue it after the war. Why? And this is very important. His concept of democracy was like this. I mean, this is what he's looking at, right? And so he says that it's a small council. He calls them elite. I call them oligarchs. He calls it just committees that run America. And then you have to sell that idea to the American people. Why? Because if they vote for it, right? If you convince them that they need to vote for this policy, they're going to think they came up with the idea and that they now own the idea. So they're going to work hard to implement it because they don't want to be wrong. And then if something goes wrong, they blame themselves, or they blame their neighbor with a different yard sign for a different political party. Well, it's your fault because you voted for that guy in there. The reality is that this has already been decided, and it's just to sell the American people on it. Now, why was American propaganda so effective? Well, Madison Avenue, right? So America had a tremendous amount of advertising experience in trying to, get the person to buy soap, get person to buy this brand of toothpaste, and do everything. So a lot of that Madison Avenue genius and being able to shape and manipulate behaviors and wants and desires and actions, that came from Madison Avenue. That came from advertising. And now it was being weaponized and put in a political sphere to be able to shape people, to make them buy into a process by which they're going to blame themselves if something goes wrong, or blame their fellow man, not blame the guy that came up with the good idea, Ferry, that came up with that idea, and then the politicians or the corporate guys that implemented it, right? In other words, we're not looking at the guy that came up with the idea or the people that implemented it. And when it fails, and hold them accountable, I'm going to hold everybody else accountable because, well, you voted for it, right? But in reality, did you? Did you get all the information that was necessary and make that choice on your own? Or were you manipulated to make that choice based on a known science and how to manipulate behavior and decisions? So that's what he talks about. And he goes into it to a certain degree. So again, democracy, as he says, and he says it's democracy. Democracy, according to Edward Bernays, is simply the elite. He calls them elite. So it's the ruling class making a decision, and then you have to sell that to a large enough body of people, or an influential enough body of people to do it. And he says, I don't have to reach everybody, right? All I need is the one person that influences a lot of people. You hit those influencers, right? And that manipulates and shapes a lot of the influence. And it's emotional, right? And it's associative. I don't even have to talk directly about the issue. I just have to build up an emotion on an associative issue, so that emotionally, if this vote comes up, you're going to vote a certain way based on your emotion, not on your rationalization of it, not on your evaluation, your logical evaluation. It's emotional based thinking. It's a responsive vote versus a reasoned appraisal of what the heck is going on, and an assessment of, okay, what's going to be better for me logically. The severe polarization of two parties into kind of an imaginary dichotomy, an imaginary opposition, is critical for that, right? So you divide half the people onto each other, and they're too busy screaming at each other to kind of look up and go, well, wait a minute, what's happening up there? What's happening, at kind of the halls of power, and noticing, the actual trend lines. If somebody has a Republican like Teddy Roosevelt, they think even now that he was this big conservative guy, right? Oh, he's great. He was a conservative guy. Now he probably would have had a lot more in common with Obama than he would, say, with Reagan. So, people forget this is kind of this, the label sometimes is used to distract you from what it is. And Bernays talks about it. The other interesting part about propaganda, book The Propaganda, is that enabling Wilson and those type of people in power to be able to frame the argument in a way that is almost diametrically opposite than what the issues are, to get people emotionally invested in it, to shape the influencers, and then to have them buy into it so that they're now invested in this program and they want to make it work because they think it was their own, right? If you convince somebody the idea is theirs, they're 9 times out of 10, they're more invested in making it work than if they think it's your idea sometimes, right? So that's what propaganda is. And he says it's not a dirty word. He's right in here. He says it's not a dirty word. It's very effective. Definitely a good book. I kind of ran over with Philip Drew, so I'm not going to go too much into it. We might do this a little bit more. But if you go in the back, you're going to see that he does talk about, the psychology. So they looked at human psychology. They measured it, especially during World War I, to, get people to kind of subvert their rational, go into the emotional, and, believe up is down, left is right, front is back, and good is bad. So all of this was actually, very, very scientifically studied and worked in there. And they've had, it's over 100 years now that this has been implemented. And it was implemented to some degree. The other thing is a council of experts. He says if you put somebody in a white coat, like a doctor, people will believe you, right? They're not going to look at your medical, but you've got a white coat and you come in, you're in a newspaper, he says newspaper or radio ad, and it's a doctor, he does it. The other thing is set up councils of experts. So if you want to sell a toothpaste, you're going to create a new or association of 10 dentists that you're going to pay. And they're going to say 9 out of 10 dentists prefer X brand toothpaste, right? And Americans will believe it because why? Well, a council of dentists said it, right? Appeal to authority and the white coats. Not that everybody can be bribed. Everybody can be manipulated and shaped. It may not be money. It may be power. It may be blackmail. It could be a whole bunch of things. You can shape other people. So people need to be aware that you have to rationally on your own look at things and don't defer to kind of this assumed authority. So again, when you read this, in addition to Rape of the Mind, but you read this with Philip Drew Administrator, and you get a much better understanding of the beginning of the 20th century in America and how we began to set up these organizational structures and patterns and institutions that over time continued to metastasize and grow to what we have now. To some degree, it evolved. In some ways, it devolved. And then you have these power structures. So it's not one guy in an office for 4 years is able to do these sorts of things. This is over time with building up organizational structures that maintain that organizational entropy and consistency. And that, they keep feeding energy into it, but it's already built, right? In other words, a lot of stuff that Wilson put in there has maintained itself. So we have an income tax, which is in there. We have the Fed system. So the government borrows money from, powerful group, and that the people are responsible for it. They took away tariffs. Some of the voting, the systems of voting, the desire you could see with Wilson and later FDR with trying to get the courts on their side, the more executive power, we're definitely down the road in executive power, have been for quite a while, right? Since FDR, really, Wilson and then FDR. And periodically you'll have a crisis or an emergency or a war, then that executive power comes back into the forefront. So just be aware that this is a very long slog, a long march through the American institutions, and that the good old days weren't really. They were fighting the same kind of intellectual, ideological, and structural battles that we are today, and that the system itself has been built over time and is kind of calcified, right? So there's a tremendous amount of inertia within a system that is 100 years old that keeps continuously getting fed by more and more money. There we go. So hopefully that was useful. Looking at those two gives you a better idea, again, of Wilson's term of the United States movement before, during, and after World War I and the League of Nations. There's a lot more with the League of Nations that we can look at, but that's basically in a nutshell what it is. Hopefully this was useful. If there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and send them over. We have a Substack, History DA. Over at Substack. We're also on X, again, Historical DA. HistoryDA.org is our website, and you can reach us out through there as well with the email at hq@historyda.org, or Facebook, X, Substack. We have a lot of channels that you can come out and try to reach into us. And I believe that's it. Have a good day.